I got to know Siobhan because not only do we share an editor and a publisher, but last year our books were published in hardcover on the same day, on January 20th. I was in our editor's office when she received the artwork for the front cover of her book. I actually think I saw the cover of your book before you did. I know. Siobhan's short story collection called You Know When the Men Are Gone. I got an early copy of the book, and I want to make a confession here. And Siobhan and I consider Siobhan a friend, so I'm going to make a confession here. I was a little hesitant about reading the book. I come from sort of like a very tree-hugging, peace sign flashing dove family, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to read a collection of short stories that focused on military families. But I, put on my big girl pants and I read it, and I was totally hooked. Siobhan's writing is both spare and really evocative, and every one of the stories in You Know When the Men Are Gone is like a punch in the gut in the best possible way. I don't know that normally a punch in the gut is a good thing, but in the case of this book it is. The thing that really amazes me is, so I read it January 2011, it is now May 2012, and I still find myself thinking about the stories in these books. It changed the way that I understand military service, military families, sacrifice, honor, loyalty. It really changed the way I see the world, and I think that's a pretty amazing thing to be able to do through stories. You Know When the Men Are Gone earned starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Library Journal, and was one of Janet Maslin of the New York Times. It was one of her book picks of 2011, and for good reason. It's the kind of book that can change hearts and minds, and we're very lucky to have Siobhan here to talk about us today. Please welcome Siobhan Fallon.
Hi. I tend to sound like a mouse up here, so I don't know if you want to get closer or wave wildly if you can't hear me. Am I all right so far? Yes? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eleanor. For those of you who haven't read The Weird Sisters, there's a reason it's been on the bestseller list from like the moment it came out, so I recommend that to all of you here. And she's just a wonderful writer and a wonderful person. Okay. For those of you who are worried I didn't have my book, I just hid it here. So it'd be a little surprise. But and thank you to everyone here at Gaithersburg. This is an unbelievable festival. I've never met so many authors myself. This is really fantastic, and I know it's free, and it's so great that it's free for us, but there are so many people who have just slaved away at this for months and months and months. So say thank you to anyone in a purple shirt, and to Judd Ashman and everyone else who has played such an intrinsic role to getting today to put together, because it's wonderful, I'm sure, for readers as well as the authors. As Eleanor said, I'll be reading from my short story collection, You Know When the Men Are Gone. And the stories are set at Fort Hood, Texas. And some of them are from the point of view of the spouses who wait at home while their soldiers are deployed to Iraq. And some of them are from the point of view of the soldiers themselves, who are either overseas or sort of trickling back and entering that kind of shaky transition period of trying to reintegrate themselves into their families' lives after being gone for an entire year. The story I'm reading from today is Camp Liberty, and my husband doesn't often get to come to my events, and this is his favorite story, so I'm reading it for him because he's always watching this little pigtailed girl over there. So thank you again, Gaithersburg, for having such a kid-friendly event that they could come. And people often ask me if my short stories are based on actual events, and I like to say that I was inspired by a lot of themes, situations, people that I saw while I was at Fort Hood or during my husband's 3 deployments. So while nothing in this book has actually happened and no one has ever said to me, oh my God, I recognize Captain Smith, the characters are sort of an amalgamation maybe of different people I've met, and some of the things unfortunately I would see occur in the military community during long deployments, but not all of them, so don't worry. And then in this story, we had a few friends who were sergeants while we were at Fort Hood, and There were four in particular who were just these brilliant young men who had all sort of given up very lucrative civilian jobs after September 11th and enlisted in the Army. And we spent a lot of time with them, and we were just amazed at, well, how smart they were. But one, they were always saying how eager they were to get out of the military. And they knew exactly their exit date, and they were counting it down. And yet, a minute later, they would start telling stories about their adventures from Iraq. So as the sort of interloper, the non-military person at the barbecues who was just like listening, taking notes, and filling up drinks, I was always struck by sort of the dichotomy of them claiming that they wanted out as soon as possible, and yet talking about their deployment and their camaraderie with such enthusiasm and passion that I really just wondered if they actually did want to get out of the Army. And that's kind of what got me thinking about this particular story, trying to figure out that puzzle. To set this up, we're in Iraq for the most part of the story. Sergeant Moog is the protagonist, and he has just been given a female interpreter named Reneen. And at first, he's really resistant to having a female terp, as they refer to them, kind of hanging around with an infantry unit, because the infantry in the United States Army is still made up of 100% men, male soldiers. But through the course of the story, they sort of create what becomes kind of problematic friendship. And Mo goes home for his mid-tour leave about the 6th month of his deployment, and that's where I'll start the story. Moog went home to New York for his 2 weeks of mid-tour leave. His parents had moved out of the city soon after 9/11 to a house on the outskirts of Cold Spring, a small town north of Manhattan near the Hudson River and commuter trains. His girlfriend Marissa came to visit, carrying a huge suitcase twice the size of Moog's duffel bag, wearing a short wool skirt and high-heeled boots. Her parents and Moog's had been friends for decades. They used to share a house together in the Hamptons in the summer, and that's where Moog would make fun of Marissa's braces until she cried. And now his parents had a guest room done up in lavender that they called Marissa's room. His mother sent them out before dinner for wine and French bread. Moog drove his father's BMW too fast, his eyes everywhere, looking for abnormalities on the side of the road that might be hiding an IED, waiting for a truck to come careening into him. Marissa tried to laugh from the passenger seat, holding on to her seatbelt. The grocery store was overwhelming. The shelves high, so many colors and options, the lights too bright. Marissa slipped her arm through his and led him to the cereal aisle, primary colored boxes rising from floor to ceiling, accosting him with the leering cartoon characters and flavors painted to look like they were exploding from bowls of milk. "Are Trix still your favorite?" she asked, as if it was a private joke, but Moog shrugged. He could smell her perfume, probably something ridiculously expensive and advertised by a rock star. He knew he'd been cold toward her. He had not yet told her how beautiful she was, or that he liked her new highlights, that he was happy she'd even come to see him. "Get whatever you like," he said. "I can eat anything." She blinked and reached for the Trix anyway, putting the box in the basket next to the Californian Zinn and still warm loaf of bread. As they left the aisle, Moog heard a tall woman speaking to a young man in a red vest. "How many times do I have to ask for organic fresh O's? It's the only cereal my daughter will eat. I've been shopping here faithfully for 5 years." Moog stopped and stared at the woman in her blue glasses. He thought of the barefoot girls in the Dora school, and he suddenly wanted to punch this woman in the head. "Davy!" Marissa called from the other aisle. The woman in the glasses had stopped speaking and was watching Moog, her plucked eyebrows lifted with annoyance and perhaps fear at the way he was standing just a little too close. Moog turned and followed Marissa's boots to the cashier. He had a runny nose and he was tired all the time. He told his family it was jet lag, and he tried to stay in bed even when he heard Marissa's voice outside his bedroom door each morning, offering him coffee and pancakes. He wanted to be back in Baghdad. The platoon leader was new, and Moog was worried about his men. It was a pain in the ass to find a different route back to base each day with the roads blocked off, covered in rubble, and he knew his men would get complacent. Would the young lieutenant remember to rearrange the order of the Humvees so that the insurgents didn't know where the leadership was situated in the convoy, especially with that damn satellite batwing antenna sticking out of the LT's passenger window like a bullseye? What about the overpass to Route Tampa, where J. Shalmeti dumped the bodies of the people they had tortured and killed? Did the lieutenant know that they had started placing bombs under the corpses, hoping to kill the American or Iraqi soldiers who gathered them up and brought them to the morgue? Everything at home annoyed him, and he knew it was irrational and misplaced. But did Marissa really need to watch Extra every night to catch up on Jessica Simpson? Did one missing woman in Missouri, sure, she was pretty, a wife and a mother of 3, did she really need to be the headlining story on every single news program? There were American soldiers, mothers and fathers, wives and husbands, dying in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why weren't Larry King and Barbara Walters interviewing their grieving families or telling their intricate life stories? He tried, he really did. He tried to care when Marissa told him about her second graders, video games, and peanut allergies. He tried to care when his mother complained about gas prices or when his father had a lousy day of golf. Something was wrong with him. Some part of him was still keyed into Baghdad, into his Humvee, his night vision goggles, his men riding down streets, not knowing what was at the end of them. Everything that he thought would make him happy here at home suddenly seemed inconsequential. He couldn't even go for a run anymore on old 9W, down to the Garrison train tracks, to glimpse the Bear Mountain Bridge sparkling over the water, the route he always took when he was visiting his parents, because one of their neighbors, an obese 55-year-old banker in a Yankees cap, might be riding a mower for a 1/4 of an acre plot of water-sprinkled and coiffed Technicolor green grass. Every time Moog saw that fat, smug face, he wanted to jump over the guy's white picket fence and beat the living shit out of him. He had to get back to Baghdad soon. Of course, when he did get back, he told everyone what they wanted to hear, that the food had never been better, filet mignon and fried calamari so good and melting in his mouth, beer cold enough to sting his tongue, gin tonics and single malt scotch, and screwing his girlfriend 3 times a day. His runny nose immediately dried up, and he felt alert again, awake at dawn to the call to prayer that reverberated around the base. It was as if his body had grown dependent on the 120-degree days and the 40-degree nights, the long-sleeve camouflage uniform and the heavy lace-up boots, the weight of the helmet and the 40-pound Kevlar vest, the tinny water fed into his mouth by a warm tube from the camelback slung over his shoulders, the churned-out high-calorie but tasteless eggs at the chow hall in the morning, sleep-deprived nights of helicopters landing or mortars ringing with the usual bad aim against the perimeter of the base. His body thrived in the desert. And Moog was seized with a terrible thought. What if, after all of his longing to get out and get on with his life, in his comfortable middle age, he would look back at this time and realize that his years in the Army were the most vivid, the most startlingly real of his entire life. Maybe he should not be getting out after all. Renine smiled at him when she saw him, the first time he had ever seen her teeth, small and white but slightly crooked in front. She suddenly looked like a kid with those funny front teeth, and it made something in Moog's stomach go soft. "Did I miss anything?" he asked, squinting into the sun. "The Dora Girls' School received a generator," she replied. "Good work," he said, and Renine blushed a high red over her sharp cheekbones. Moog had to look at the sun again, letting it blind him for a moment so he wouldn't blush too. Their next mission was not a humanitarian effort in any way. The battalion had been relying on an informant for the past few months, Yasin Mustafa. When an American soldier died during a raid, they knew that Mustafa was no longer trustworthy. So Moog and a platoon of Iraqi soldiers were going to Mustafa's compound in the middle of the night to bring him back to the base for questioning. There were no shots fired. The bodyguards shouted and waved their AKs, but when they saw how outnumbered they were, they suddenly shrugged and smiled and started sharing cigarettes with the Iraqi soldiers who accompanied the Americans. Mustafa himself came out with his arms open and invited everyone in for tea and dates, and agreed, with only a slight narrowing of his eyes, to return to the base. "I bring a lawyer, yes? Like on American television. Miranda writes?" And he laughed with such confidence that Moog knew he would be free by morning, no matter how many U.S. soldiers had died because of his double dealing. They didn't even need to cuff him. Renine emerged from his house a few minutes later, her face tilted down, and Moog assumed that she hadn't had any luck either with the children and wives. The ride back was quiet, none of the usual high fives and whoops of delight from a mission accomplished, as if every soldier knew that tonight had been a waste of time, that they might have gotten the bad guy, but in the end the bad guy had gotten one over on them. "So the women didn't give anything up?" Moog asked Renine. She turned toward him, her eyes full of pupil and fear. "His second wife said she knew me," she whispered, "that I am an infidel and will die an infidel's death." Moog tried to smile. "I hear that all the time." Renine shook her head. "She knew I am a widow, that my husband was a professor. She knew me." Moog swiped sweat from his face. He didn't know Renine was a widow. "Maybe you ought to live on Camp Liberty for a while. You'd be safe and could even sleep in the morning." But she looked away. "I have a daughter." Moog swallowed. He didn't know that either. He had assumed Renine was in her 20s, but now that the dim light from the Humvee controls, he could see that she was older, early 30s perhaps, with lines around her mouth. "Maybe just for a little while," he said. "I don't think there are any other women Terps right here right now, so you'd get your own quarters. You could visit your daughter on your days off." Renine nodded, tears in her eyes, and Moog looked away in embarrassment. This is why there aren't women in the infantry, he thought to himself. But his stomach went soft again, and he was relieved to know that Renine would be close by. Thank you. So I'm hoping that at least a few of you have some questions for me. So is there like a clock somewhere that should tell me when to stop talking?
About 5:20.
Oh, it's 5:20? Okay.
You
Really?
have until 5:20, 5 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so please, I have a lot of time left, so let's not waste Gaithersburg's time and somebody ask me something, please.
I think I read this, but is this your first book?
Yes. My first book. I've had short stories published in magazines since 2000, but this is the first time they've all been stuck in one nice thing that I can stick on my shelf.
And is this the first time that you've gathered together the same topic?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I know your husband's in the military. Did you seek out other reads from either military wives or military personnel to kind of clarify what you're doing? And you feel very confident being around so many military people that you felt confident you could tell these stories? Or do a lot of research?
I was living at Fort Hood while I was writing the stories, and I'd already been through 2 deployments on my own, and my husband was getting ready to go on another when I started them. And sort of been part of the Army world for what seemed like a while at that point. And he was a company commander, and I was a family readiness group leader. So those of you who've read the book, I talk a little bit about that in the book. But he was in charge of 160 soldiers, and I was kind of the main contact for all of their spouses, moms, dads, whoever wanted to send an email or make a phone call, find out if their soldier was okay, if they saw something on the news, they needed to be reassured. They'd sort of get in touch with me. So at that time in my life, I had a particular insight into a lot of different military families in a way that I hadn't, even as a military spouse, before. So I think that worked its way into my fiction. And I've always been a really good eavesdropper. I was a bartender for a long time, and I like listening to people's stories, and soldiers at a barbecue love to tell their stories. So, I did actually. But I kind of finished it all before my husband read everything. And to this day, the poor man is plagued with having to read anything from like a Facebook post to my news story. So he's my military expert or consultant. But we had a few friends read different things, and he talked to one of his battalion commanders to see if I'd have issues with the military or the Army, what their reaction might be. And his boss, who was also a writer, said, "Your wife is a civilian. She's writing fiction. She has nothing to worry about. The Army does not care." And we called some, what do you call them? The POs? Yes, public affair officers at some of the larger bases, including Fort Hood, and they didn't even want to talk to me. Like, they really just did not think it was an issue at all. Like, I exchanged a couple emails. They didn't want to look at a copy of my book. They just said, "Yeah, you're a civilian. Go to it." So the Army's actually been very good to me, and most of my military readers have been really positive and have enjoyed the stories and given me great feedback. So thank you. Thank you for... Yes?
Stories are just stunning.
Oh.
By the first paragraph in every story, you pull in immediately. And I was just wondering, do you cut a lot? Do you revise? Because they are so spare, as Eleanor was saying, but there's so much underneath everything. They are so evocative, and the way they impart the understanding of what these families, these young men and women are going through, nothing like that is when you read the news, you don't get it the same way as you do in the story. So
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Can you ask me a question too?
what I was wondering is, you have to cut a lot because they're so sparely written and so to the point. Do they come out that way, or do you find that you write a lot more and then you have to revise and come out?
Yeah, I revise like a maniac. My literary agent just finally had to say, like, just stop it. Just you're done. You don't think you're done, but you're done. I'm sending it out. So while I was pregnant with my daughter, I wrote the draft for all of the stories, but then I continued working on them for like 2.5 years. So there are like a lot of layers and different characters that sort of would make their way from one story into another, and I at one point wanted to kill off one character, and then I changed my mind. I couldn't do it, so I had to kill off another. So, there are lots of different changes, and yeah, a lot of work and a lot of revision. And I hate revision. I like writing the fresh stuff. That's when it's fun, when you have this great idea or character to put on paper. But I'm also very shy, as you probably all have noticed, since my voice is shaking uncontrollably. But it's hard for me to imagine a story going out there unless I feel like it's as close as I can get it. And I still didn't think I had it as close as I wanted it, but I had to listen to the bosses, my editor and my husband too. So I had to let it go in the end. Yes. Thank you. Yes, sorry.
That's okay. I don't like talking in front of crowds either. I was wondering, on top of that question, do you start with characters for this type of writing, or do you start with kind of a story and then, because particularly I have the same feeling, like with the story Remission, those characters are just so well done, and it comes out slowly, and so I'm wondering, like, do you have an idea of, I have this daughter who feels this way about something, and then kind of build that in, or do you start with the story itself?
A lot of my stories start with endings. In that particular story, I had the image of the mom and the daughter trying to connect at the end. And I was, like I said, pregnant while I was writing that story, and I was sort of thinking, what is the worst scenario I could possibly have? Like, how bad could this kid in my belly be someday? So that was part of me, like, sort of writing my own demons down, too. And then the story Leave, about the man in the basement, for those of you who read that, I actually started that story with a completely different ending in mind, and it was the ending that came to me, and I eventually had to cut it and change the ending. But I sort of see, like, the resolution of my stories before I even know what the problem is, and I work backwards a little. And the character, though, the main character is always, or usually in that scene in such a way that I want to figure out more about them, and yet have a vivid picture of what I need to develop. So, yeah, thank you. Yes. Hi,
Are you still kind of working on military stories, or have you kind of shifted your writing?
Right now I'm working on a novel, but two of the primary characters are a military family, or an officer and his spouse. And then the other two main characters are civilians. So I'm branching out a little bit now. And I think it's probably because I have not actually lived on a base since Fort Hood when I wrote this book. So my husband's job has changed a little bit, and we lived abroad in the Middle East for the past year, in Amman, Jordan. And that works its way into what I'm writing now, sort of the travels we had, and kind of being American living in the Middle East at such a pivotal time in history, and reactions to Americans and this idea of the Arab Spring. And so it's pretty early on in the novel, so I haven't seen that ending yet. Oh, actually, I kind of have, but I'm not going to tell you. But yeah, so please cross your fingers for me that I can pull off a novel. Yeah.
Sounds fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Do you have a regular routine for your writing? Is it something you do every single day during set times? Do you have a toddler, so you must be pretty busy with life?
Yeah, but now we have preschool
Oh.
here in Virginia, so I am very happy. And for the first time, I do actually have a schedule. When I was working on this book, the Army gave Army spouses 16 hours of free childcare a month, and I would hang out in a Burger King that was right next to Chaffee Child Development and use every single minute to work on these stories. And now I kind of don't know what to do with myself because I can sit I have a home office. I mean, it's just crazy. And hours to work on the novel. And so yes, so I do. I try and get something creative, at least like an hour or two of creative writing for 5 days a week. Thanks. Anyone?
I have another question.
Yeah, please.
So,
Yeah.
in the story Leave,
Mm-hmm.
does he kill them?
Oh. Yeah. Don't answer it. Email me. I'll give you my card, and I will tell you exactly what I think. Yeah, happened. But that, as I said, that ending, I had the opposite ending when I originally wrote that story, and each version of it, he became a little bit more unhinged, or he wasn't turning off the war mindset until my readers were like, this ending doesn't match up. So I had to write an ending that matched the story for that. Yeah, but do get my card. Okay, thank you. And just if any of you have book clubs that are reading my book, I love to Skype with book clubs, and you're actually not very far if you're here in Maryland. So send me an email and we can get in touch. Yes, sir. Yeah, I do have some kid characters. I have a teenager in one of them and a couple babies. So I had sort of limited understanding of children before I had one of my own. But so I kept them in diapers. That was sort of easier to imagine. But there are some kids. Kids are awesome. Yeah, I love them. Anyone else? Looks like we're good. All right. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you.